Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Okay, welcome back to all my friends and listeners out there. You got Jim here. Now, today we are going to continue in my study on the history of the church, the history of Christianity. And this is my third study on that history. I've got probably a couple of hundred pages of notes, been doing this for about 3 months now. And I think I'm pretty much ready to take you right through up to the and through the Reformation. So, up until this point, the Christian church has been mostly divine. But now vestiges of the old apostles and the old followers of Paul are beginning to pass off the scene, and others are beginning to come in and take over. And what happens is, late in the 2nd century, this takes place, a development takes place that really greatly hinders the task of historians who seek to discern the later career of the apostles. And what happened was the church is now becoming more humanized. What happened was the churches in every important city began claiming apostolic origins. There was a rivalry between Rome and Antioch. The church in Alexandria felt constrained to have an apostolic founder, and thus the tradition appeared, according to the Gospel of Mark, who had founded the church there, and when Constantinople became the capital city of the empire, they also needed a religion with apostolic roots. So their claim was that Philip, the Apostle Philip, had preached in Byzantium, the ancient site where Constantinople was later built. And there are many, many other traditions regarding apostolic activities, the chief of which are the Catholic Church. And these new apostolic traditions and new apostolic churches in these different cities are, how should I say it? They're not truthful. They're not telling their people what really happened. They're beginning to make some stuff up. This is particularly true of the traditions regarding the origins of Christianity in Spain and India. Christians in Spain claimed that their land was missioned not only by Paul, but by Peter and James. And we know that didn't happen. The legend regarding Peter's missionary to Spain appeared in the 5th century. That's when that started. But it was nowhere near as influential as that of James, the half-brother of Jesus, coming to their country, which happened 3 centuries later. So it's all human lies now. According to these traditions, James proclaimed the gospel with really no success in Galatia and Saragossa. The story goes that as he returned back, the Virgin Mary appeared to him on a pillar and gave him words of encouragement. And that's the origin of the Virgen del Pilar. Spanish people still venerate that site. It's still high up in Spanish tradition. Now, back in Jerusalem, James was beheaded by Herod, so I don't know how that could happen. Then the disciples took his remains. This is crazy. Then it says his disciples took his remains back to Compostela in Spain. Compostela. where they are supposedly buried to this day. Now, do you see what's going on here? Everybody's trying to one-up everybody else. The church is becoming something that it was never meant to be. And this is now going to be the beginnings of the origin of the chief of all lying denominations, the Catholics. So I hope I'm not offending anybody, but this is history, okay? And this legend of James's remains being in Compostela have great significance later on in Spain. They call him Saint James. In Spanish, it's Santiago. He becomes the patron saint of the nation. Now, during the war against the Moors, the name of Santiago was used as a battle cry. At the same time, pilgrimages began to the shrine of St. James of Compostela. It's just getting crazier and crazier. There became an order of St. James in Spanish history. And even though James never went to Spain, the legends regarding his visit were cast in stone. The tradition claims that Thomas, remember Doubting Thomas, one of Jesus' apostles, visited India. And that didn't happen. It appears for the first time in a book called The Acts of Thomas, which was written at the end of the 2nd century. He's long gone. So how does he write a book? But this is the kind of stuff that's now going on in supposedly the Christian church. As far as the legend of Thomas is concerned, we're told that an Indian king, Gondophares, was seeking an architect to build a palace, and that Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, he was no architect, he was a fisherman. But he offered himself to Gondophares for the job. And when the king found that Thomas was giving to the poor the money allotted to the construction of the palace, he put him in prison. But then Gondophares' brother, Gad, died and came back from the dead. That's the legend. And upon his return, he told his brother Gondophares that heaven was a magnificent place which was being built through the gifts that Thomas was giving to the poor. Then Gondophares was converted and baptized, and Thomas moved over into other parts of India, and he died as a martyr. None of that stuff happened. So the legends are duplicitous, fictitious. History had no record of Gondophares, nor any of the other details of that story. But when we start getting into the Catholic Church and their lies, I'm telling you, it steps up to a new level. So the conclusion is that most of the apostles, including Peter, Paul, John, the legend says that they traveled proclaiming the gospel, and the surviving churches had been founded either by them or by others. But my question is, what gospel are they preaching? Because the gospel of the kingdom, which they all preached, as well as Jesus Christ, never happened. Right? Was there ever a king and a kingdom in Israel? No. So the gospel that they are preaching is a gospel that's totally dead now. The new gospel is the gospel that Paul's preaching, the gospel of grace. So to even think that Peter, Paul, and John went around preaching the gospel of the kingdom by this time is utterly ridiculous. Most of the traditions regarding apostolic travels, when it was believed that the apostles divided the world among themselves, and when the church in each country and city sought to claim one of the apostles to be the origin of their church, is a total lie. A total lie. So why don't we put some of this in its proper context? From the very beginning, Christianity had problems. The Lord, whom Christians served, died on the cross, condemned as a criminal. Stephen was then stoned to death about 7 years later, following his preaching before the Jews. Then James was killed at Herod Agrippa's order, James the brother of John. And ever since then, right up to our own day, there have been those who have had to seal their witness with blood. Yet the reasons for persecution and the manner in which it was carried out over the years have varied. In the early decades of the life of the church, listen to these developments. There was a new Jewish sect. The early Christians didn't believe that they were following a new religion. They were all Jews. Remember, I taught you all this. They were all Jews. The people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah were still Jews, right up until the beginning of the new religion, which was Christianity in Acts 11. So everybody that believed that Jesus was the Messiah for the first 7 years after his advent were Jews. So the Christian message to Jews was not that they should abandon their Jewishness. On the contrary, now that the Messianic age had begun, they were supposed to be better Jews. And likewise, their early proclamation to Gentiles was not an invitation to accept a newly born religion. Paul didn't do that. Paul went to the synagogues first with his new message of grace. But they didn't want to get out from the yoke of the Mosaic law. Gentiles invited children of the Abrahamic faith to become Christians. But they didn't want it. They rejected it. So this invitation was made possible because since the time of the prophets, Judaism had believed that through the advent of the Messiah, all nations would be brought to Israel. That was the plan. And for those early Jewish believers in the Messiah, Judaism was not a rival religion to Christianity, but the same faith, even though those who followed it didn't see or believe that the prophecies had been fulfilled. Most of Israel did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So from the point of view of those Jews who rejected Christianity, rejected the belief that Jesus was the Messiah and this new gospel of grace, the situation was understood that they thought that believing in Jesus Christ was a heretical sect within Judaism. They were shunned. And as we saw in the first century, Judaism was not a monolithic entity, but included lots of different sects of Judaism. And this is where Christianity now enters the scenes. Jews saw it as just another sect. That's why Paul and Peter in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council shook hands. And Peter told Paul, all right, listen, I'm going to go preach the gospel of the kingdom. You go preach your gospel of grace to the Gentiles. They shook hands on it. So for all intents and purposes, Peter just considered this a new sect of Judaism. But it wasn't. It's a completely new doctrine, the doctrine of grace. Remember, when Jews became Jews, they had to obey the Sabbath. They had to obey the feast days. They had to repent of their sins. They had to be baptized. They had to obey the Mosaic law. There were tons and tons of things they had to do. The new gospel of grace given to Paul out in the desert by Jesus Christ said that you simply have to believe that he was murdered on the cross, was buried, and rose from the dead. Period. No baptism necessary, no repentance necessary, nothing necessary except believing. And that's what Paul stresses in all of his, or most of his epistles. Romans, Ephesians, Galatians. That's his message, man. There's something new under the sun. You don't need the Mosaic law. So now what happens is because of that, the attitude of those Jews, during the early years of Paul's missionary journeys, the attitude is they're seeing Christianity from the perspective as a new heresy going from town to town, tempting good Jews to become heretics. And many Jews believed, actually with some biblical foundation, that the reason they had lost their independence and were made subject of the Roman Empire was that people had not sufficiently remained faithful to the traditions of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nationalistic and patriotic sentiment was aroused by the fear that these new heretics, these Christians, could once more bring the wrath of God upon Israel. It's really, it's totally humanistic. But for those reasons, in most of the New Testament, it is Jews who persecute Christians, right? And then in turn, they seek the refuge of the Roman authorities. And that happened to the Jews in Corinth. They accused Paul before Gallio, the proconsul, saying, "This man is persuading men to worship God contrary to the law." And Gallio answers, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, I should have no reason to hear you. O Jews, but since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourself. I refuse to be a judge of these things." That comes from Acts 18, 14 and 15. So later, when there's a riot because some claim that Paul's brought a Gentile to the temple and some Jews are trying to kill him, it's the Romans that save Paul's life. I mean, this is just craziness, right? So the Romans, the Jews, and the Christians agree that what was taking place was a conflict among Jews. The Romans looked at Jews and Christians as virtually the same people. And they were thinking that as long as things remain orderly, no riots and things, Romans prefer to stay out of these things. But if there was a riot or disorder, like there was in 66 AD, they came in 70 and totally destroyed the city. So, let me give you another good illustration of this. The Emperor Claudius, in 51 AD, enacted a law that expelled Jews from Rome. In Acts 18:2, it mentions that the Jews were, it was necessary for them to leave that city. But it doesn't really explain the reason for it. Suetonius, a Roman historian, if you want to Google his name, it's Suetonius. He said that the Jews were expelled from the city for disorderly conduct because of Chrestus. And many agree that Chrestus, and you can look that name up, Chrestus, is none other than Christus. And that what actually took place in Rome was that the Christians proclaimed that they were causing so many riots among Jews that the emperor decided to expel them all. He just put them all in one big pot, Jews and Christians, even though there was certainly a dichotomy there. So during that period of AD 51, Romans still saw the conflict between Christians and Jews as an internal matter within Judaism. That's not the way Paul saw it. That's not the way the Jews saw it. But that's the way it was, because Rome was in charge. So the distinction between Christians and Jews became clearer and clearer as the church gained more converts from the Gentile populations to Christianity. And as that happened, the Jews began to diminish. The Jewish nation and Jewish nationalism decreased and eventually led to a rebellion against Rome. And much of that rebellion was blamed on Christians. It was so interesting. Back then, the story of Jewish-Christian relations in the first years of Christianity had these really fateful consequences. Because while Christianity appeared as a heretical act within Judaism and later they tried to suppress it, you can see in some of the books in the New Testament, since the time, Jews have not been in a position where they could persecute Christians. In fact, the opposite was often the case. When Christianity became the official religion of the majority in Rome, there were those who, on the basis of what the New Testament says about the opposition of Judaism to Christianity, and without any regard whatsoever for the different historical circumstances, they declared the Jews to be a rejected race. That's how it all started, anti-Semitism. They were persecuted, they were massacred. And that attitude would have been abhorrent to Paul, man. That was the apostle of love. So, let's talk a little bit about this nutcase Nero. After the Emperor Claudius passed away, who gets on the scene but Nero? Nero comes to power thanks to his mother's intrigues. He reached the Roman throne on October in AD 54. And in the beginning, he was a reasonable ruler. He wasn't unpopular. His laws in favor of the dispossessed were very well received by the Roman populace. But he became increasingly infatuated by dreams of grandeur, dreams of lust, pleasure, and he began to surround himself with a court where everybody vied to satisfy his every whim. You know, it's not unlike Kim Jong-un or Adolf Hitler or any of the tyrants over the years. Now, 10 years after he was made king in 64 AD, he was now despised. Poets and artists were mocking him because Nero proclaimed that he was one of them. He was a poet, he was an artist, and he was nothing like that. So soon in Rome and the surrounding territories, the rumor began circulating that Nero was crazy. And that's when the state of things on the night of June 18th, AD 64, that great fire broke out in Rome, right? Nero was in his palace in Antium, and when he heard the news, he hurried to Rome, where he organized the fight against the fire. He was the head fireman. He opened up his home, the gardens of his palace, to the people who were now homeless, as well as other public buildings. But despite this, there were those who suspected that he started the fire, which he didn't. He was actually in Antium. But many blamed him for the fire. The fire lasted 6 days and 7 nights, and then it flared up again sporadically 3 more days. So about 14 sections of Rome were completely destroyed. Because back then everything was made of wood and mud and straw. So in the midst of this suffering, the rank and file clamored for justice. Who's responsible? So in order to get himself off the hook, Nero had to put the blame on somebody else, and he blamed Christians. The Roman historian Tacitus, who was probably present at the time, recorded a lot of the rumors that circulated, but people were inclined to believe that the fire began accidentally in an oil warehouse. And more people suspected that it was Emperor Nero. It began to be rumored that he had spent most of his time during the fire on top of a tower on the Palatine, dressed as an actor, playing his flute, or his lute, and singing about the destruction of Troy. The guy was a nut. Then the story goes on that in his presumptuousness as a poet, he had ordered the city destroyed so that the fire would inspire in him a great epic poem. This is actually what was going through his head. So Nero tried to allay those suspicions, but it soon became clear that he wasn't going to succeed in this as long as there was no one else to blame. So he had to find somebody to blame. Now, there were two areas. This is so interesting. There were two areas of the city that had not burned. And what were they? The Jewish section and the Christian section. So Nero really had no choice but to blame the Christians. And Tacitus tells the story. I'm going to quote Tacitus right here. He says, "In spite of every human effort, of the emperor's largesse, and of the sacrifices made to the gods, nothing sufficed to allay suspicion nor to destroy the opinion that the fire had been ordered. Therefore, in order to destroy this rumor, Nero blamed the Christians, who are hated for their abominations, and punished them with a refined cruelty." What beautiful language this is. Christ, from whom they take their name, Christians, was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Stopped for a moment, this evil superstition reappeared, not only in Judea, where was the root of the evil, but also in Rome, where all things sordid and abominable from every corner of the world came together. Thus, first those who confessed that they were Christians were arrested, and on the basis of their testimony a great number were condemned, although not so much for the fire itself as for their hatred of humankind. That comes from Tacitus, my friends. Man, those words have great value. This is one of the most ancient indications of how pagan people, like Rome, viewed Christians. And when you read those lines, it's clear that Tacitus doesn't believe that the fire in Rome was set by Christians. Matter of fact, he knows it. Furthermore, he doesn't approve of Nero's refined cruelty to Christians. All the same, though, this good and cultured Roman, Tacitus, believes a great deal of what is being said about those abominations of Christians and their hatred of humankind. He wasn't the only one. Tacitus had other contemporary authors that did not tell us what these supposed abominations were. There was no proof that the Christians were doing abominations. Second century authors were very much more explicit, even though they weren't around in that time. But in any case, Tacitus believes the rumors and thinks that Christians hate humankind. And this last charge makes sense if you remember that all social activities back there in Roman arena between 54 and 64 AD, the theater, the army, the letters, the sports, were so entwined with pagan worship that Christians often felt the need to abstain from going to the theater, joining the army, writing letters, and partaking in sports. So, in the eyes of people like Tacitus, who loved his culture and society, Christians did appear as haters of humankind. He writes this. This is Tacitus. "Before killing the Christians, Nero used them to amuse the people. Some were dressed in furs to be killed by dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were set on fire early in the night, so that they might illuminate it. Nero opened his own gardens for these shows, and in the circus he himself became a spectacle, for he mingled with the people dressed as a charioteer, and he rode around in his chariot. All of this aroused the mercy of the people, even against these culprits who deserved an exemplary punishment, for it was clear that they were not being destroyed for the common good, but rather to satisfy the cruelty of one person, Nero." So once again, folks, in this pagan historian Tacitus, while he shows no love for Christians, he does indicate that the reason for the persecution had nothing to do with justice. It was simply the whim of Emperor Nero. And these lines are also one of the few surviving pagan testimonials of the cruel tortures to which the early Christians were subjected. It's it's still, to this day, really hard to know the extent of Nero's persecution. Christian writers from the last part of the first century into the second do recall the horrors of those days. It's also likely that both Peter and Paul were killed by Nero. Now, there's no mention of any persecution outside the city of Rome at this time. But on the other hand, there's no mention of any persecution outside the city of Rome, and therefore it's probably likely that this persecution by Nero was limited to Rome. And although the first Christians were charged with this arson, they were persecuted for the mere fact that they were Christians. And the fact that they were Christians, they became the abominations connected with that name. Many ancient writers tell us that Nero issued an edict against Christians, but if that edict ever existed, nobody can find it. So here's what happens. In AD 68, Nero was deposed by a rebellion that gained the support of the Roman Senate, and then Nero killed himself. And then the persecution ceased. But nothing was done. It's like what happens here in the United States. You pass a law 30 years ago, and it never gets unpassed, even though times change. Well, the persecution ceased in Rome, and although the persecution ceased, the laws that Nero passed were never rescinded against Christians. So, because of that, a period of political turmoil followed, to the point where in AD 69 is actually known as the year of the four emperors. So eventually Vespasian gained control of the government, and during his reign of that, his son Titus was the next emperor to come along. So I think that's going to do it for today's teaching on the history of Christianity. Hope you guys are enjoying this. Make sure and take some notes so you can Google all these names that I'm giving you. There's going to be more and more to come. You're not going to believe some of the people in the history of the church. It's just incredible. Anyway, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. You're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Hope you all have a great day. God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. If you like what you hear, and you think your friends and relatives would benefit by the teaching, please share it with everyone you know. Thanks, and have a great day.